Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost, I would like to say thank you for viewing this video, and subsequently visiting my channel. And the topic of this video will be on the phenomenology of INFPs. And the reason I'm motivated to make this video is because I think that the things I said in my last videos were not as clearly delineated as they possibly could have been. And it's the case that many of these ideas for myself, the ways in which I construct them is fairly original, and what I'm trying to do with typology is uniquely my own, and so I don't really always know how to go about saying something and coming up with a representation that I'm coming up of something, and so I make a lot of mistakes or things that I don't particularly care for or like. And so the thing I wanted to talk about in this video is specifically the orientation of the INFP as a creature in the world, because it's the case that for the most part INFPs are phenomenologists. They're very much concerned with being in the world and what it means to be in the world. And there's a reason for that that has to deal with neurobiology, and in order to understand that reason, one has to understand what emotions are and what feelings are. Emotions are the drives, the kings or gods of the brain, the very things that animate you, create you, and inspire you to act and to move in the world. And the feelings are their messengers, and the neurotransmitters that send the signals that act on your body in such a way to elicit physiological responses that tell you whether or not you're jumping straight or moving right or behaving correctly. Basically, a neurotransmitter is just a electrical impulse. And there are a lot of these types of things, but not so many that they're uncountable and unnameable. And it's the case that you have a certain set of neurotransmitters that are specifically agents of the emotions, and they travel various substrates and patterns of substrates such that you have consistent neurological phenomenon that you know as emotions or feelings. Like that's what it is. Now it's the case though that because it's like this, feelings are embodied things. You have it such that you have the impressionistic landscape in your mind of whenever it is you're angry or whenever it is you're sad, but it's the case that the reason you feel in the first place is because of a host of physiological responses that run up the chain and network. So you encounter a stimulus in the environment, it causes you to have an automatic response, because for the most part feelings are action potentials in the body, and so you have these action potentials signal off something to the brain, and the brain tells itself to go into a certain state and tells a certain piece of itself to be more active than not, like whether it's the amygdala or whatever part of the brain that it tells to be more active. And because that part of the brain is active, a certain dialogue and set of actions and behaviors will then be acted out in terms of using you as an instrument to do something in the world, basically. And we know, and the basic way we know these things is such, we know this basic mechanism under the name of the fight or flight response. That's just a very easy one, and one that's well known. And that's all emotions and feelings are. And that's what the INFP knows most intimately. It's what they care to trouble their perception and their observations about. and that's because of their introverted feeling, because one thing that you have to understand about human beings is that we're pattern seeking. We're fundamentally pattern seeking. That's how we understand the world, because it's not as if you see the world in the way that it actually is. It's the case that you have a certain set of patterns that are made manifest to you by way of your proprioception, by way of your tactile experience, by way of the current heat and temperature of your body, by the makeup of the flora in your gut and like all of the bacteria on your skin. You're to a whole other cohort and consortium of other factors and agency. Like, you have a lot of things that are telling you where you are and orientating you in the world. And it's the case that this landscape of orientation constitutes your perception, but all of the individual pieces of this perception are just patterns. And like, our brain just puts these patterns together in an intelligible way based off of what other people tell us, based off of how we interact with the world and the reactions we receive from objects, and that constitutes roughly memory. And that's all you know, and that's all you see. Now, the case is that whenever you're dealing with that landscape, there's two ways you can go about appraising and making up your perceptual scheme. It could either be based off of thinking, or it could be based off of feelings. Feelings are qualitative, thinking is objective, like whatever you want. And I should say thinking is instrumental. Feeling is qualitative, thinking is instrumental. And what I mean by instrumental is that all of the things that you know and experience in the world are just patterns, but there is a thing you can do with these patterns. You can pull them out of their context because you're an abstracting thing, and you can figure out ways to fix them over time and close them off from the rest of the world and use them as a tool. And so thinking is mostly tool making and instrumental in its orient. The thing about an INFP is that they're not interested in that mode of perception as much as they're interested in the mode of perception that's qualitatively based. And that's because meaning precedes objects. And there's a real reason why, because the whole world is made up of patterns. It's just one big bloody pattern. And so it's the case that the things that you find that are most salient to you as a creature that feels and acts in the world as a thing, something that's primarily made up of being, the thing about that is that the things that make it such that you actually want to be, and the things that actually make you up as the creature you are, god damn it, sorry, as the creature you are not based on, they're non-delineatable, and oftentimes they're unable to be decontextualized because the part of the brain that's concerned with them and the part of the brain that spots them, that watches them, and that intimately concerns itself with them is nonverbal and not what we would classically consider rational. And it's the case that that part of the brain is also the part of the brain that's concerned with the self. And it's the case that everything that's interesting and animatory to it as a specialized unit, because funnily enough, the human brain is highly specialized in non-integrated. The part of the brain that's because it's a part of that part of the brain, introverted feeling looks the way that it does. Because when you're talking about the mid and well, that's the way that it's the mammalian brain. It's the reptilian and the mammalian brain, and it's the right hemisphere mostly. Like, that's what it is. And it's the case that the right hemisphere is concerned with all activity and actions of a human being, and it has its way of contributing to speech and language. It has its way of contributing to physical activity or motor patterns. It has its way of contributing to all phenomena that we associate with being human, but the ways in which it chooses to contribute to those phenomena is very different than how the left chooses to contribute to it, and it's non-instrumentative. It's non-objectively based. And that's how all animals are. And that's how human beings have been for a very, very long time. All animals have right and left hemispheres, but it's not the case that all animals are abstracting. And it's not the case that all animals have prefrontal cortexes. But bilateral symmetry of the brain is something that's apparent in all mammals. But it's not the case that all mammals think like human beings do. And it's the case that for INFPs, they're more concerned with those things that are most intrinsic to our mammalian and anthropomorphic qualities that was in early mankind. They're fundamentally concerned with the things that animate us and make us be in the world. The things that I say make us human. That's what they're concerned with. And there's a reason why it looks the way that it does, because when you want to talk about meaning, it's a very funny thing. Because you as a creature are embedded in a context of resolution. Multiple resolutions. Like no single one. You don't just exist in your room. You exist in your family. You exist in the communities that you're a part of. Then those communities exist, well, you even exist in various other substructures of society that it deems profitable or acceptable, like institutions in terms of education or your whatever place or job or place of employment you have. And then that thing is innervated in the society that you're a part of. And that society is innervated in terms of the whole overarching complex, the abstract complex of the state. And then that thing is innervated or gives rise to the emergent and rather amorphous complex of the nation. And then that thing is embedded within the complex of federal law or the federal state. And all of those things influence and affect you as an individual. And then more so, you have a very deep, long line of evolutionary history that makes you look the way that you do and act the way that you act, and why you have the various degrees of freedoms and proclivities to do anything in the first place as a human being, period. And an INFP is fundamentally concerned with that landscape. They're concerned with it because to them it's the one that's most meaningful. And you can understand why, because if you're concerned with meaning, and what the hell is meaning? Yeah, because I say that a lot. Meaning is what makes you want to be in the world, period. Like, what makes you want to exist. Human beings don't have to exist. Like, they really don't. And okay, meaning, meaning is a psychological substance, and it's one that is apparent because you're something that constructs narratives. So for whatever reason, human beings like to tell stories. Like, that's how we tend to make sense of our lives. We tend to dramatize them, and we tend to talk about our lives as dramatizations. And it's the case that before we had any other way of communicating, we had non-verbal cues, pictures, and stories. Like, that's it. Like, that's really all that was there for our ability to understand and understand the world and navigate and talk about the world and talk about ourselves in the world. And so that's because biology is mostly hierarchically based, your brain is mostly hierarchically based, it has tiers to it. The oldest things are the most important things, or the oldest things are the ones, I wouldn't say that, yeah, so if you, it depends on like what kind of value you want to give things. The oldest things, you can look at it this way, the oldest things are the most important things, because the oldest things are the only things that make it such that you want to live, and they're the only things that make it so that you can live, and they're the only things that make it such that you know most of what you know in the world. Most of your brain is not conscious, and most of it is not concerned with instrumentation. And so that's what the INFP is concerned with. Like that's because they're concerned with meaning, and it precedes objects for a very real reason. Because say you want to talk about something like love or freedom, they're not simple. Like they're not simple in the sense that you can love something that's not in front of you. I don't know if. Okay, sorry. People are calling me a lot today. You can love something that's not in front of you. Like you can have. So for example, like you love a person, but you kind of love the idea about the person, because even if somebody brings that person up when they're not in front of you, you have the same feelings. You have the same feelings because you're impressionistic. Your memory is very contextualized and impressionistic. It's also the case that you can love somebody that's not even alive any longer. Like that's fairly peculiar and strange. Like that also has to do with the fact that you're a contextualized and abstracting thing. You can you love your friends, you love your family, and you love your romantic partners, but not all in the same ways. Though they're the same, it's the same suite of emotions that make it such that you experience that phenomenon, period. And then you can love objects in terms of the ways that you choose to value them, and you can love, hell, you can love a lot of things. Is it the case that it's all the same thing? Yes, but is it really all the same thing? No. But is it all pointing to something that's very, very necessary to our survival, and something that's very important to our existence as human beings? Yes, on multiple levels of resolution, because the Greeks had a very good conception of love in terms of philaic, eros, and agape. And it's the case that love, if you want to be romantic in your orient, will be something that is a binding agent to being in the world. Like, why else would you want to be in the world? What else would you want to do in the world? What else would you want to be in the world? That's why there are those romantic types that just talk about everything needs love. But, like, I don't think that way, but that's how they think, you know, like, whatever. And but there's a reason why they think that way, because let's say you wanted to, the reason why you have to be concerned with that and not instrumentation is because you can't instrumentalize love. Like, you really can't, you can't do it. You can maybe stick somebody under an MRI, and you can maybe stick somebody under EEG and see exactly what's going on in the biology for that person, in particular the neurobiology. Well, the biology, period, from the neurophysiology to the actual physiology of the person, because all of that says whether or not somebody loves another person, strangely enough. And it's the case that if you want to talk about it more than just biology in terms of the actual lived experience or the narrative, you can't delineate it. Because you as a creature live in very deep contexts. Contexts that aren't, like, immediate to you. Historic ones, very, very strong historic ones that you can't see, but they make it such that the world looks the way that it does, and makes it such that you will love the things that you choose to love, even though love is a universal and biologically instantiated thing, because there's something funny about you in terms of the ways that you're made up. You're not only a thinking thing, but you're a historic thing, and you're a behavioral thing, and you're also a biological instinctual thing. And because you're all of these things simultaneously, the world you live in is very, very complex. And if you take the time, which INFPs take all the bloody time in the world, because that's the only thing that they care about, to look at it, it's very, 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 very rich. It's very, very rich and complicated. And so it's also why they don't bother, it's also why they have a very hard time speaking about it. Because you can't really, how do you talk about something that you can't talk about? Because it doesn't exist in any specific context. It exists cross-contextually. in multiple ways on every resolution of analyses. And so if you want to talk about that thing, it's rather difficult. But those are the only things that have meaning in the first place. And so those are the only things that they would concern themselves with. And those are the things that we describe in ideographs. And an ideograph is something that has a lot of meaning, but has no definite meaning. It has a lot of meaning, but it doesn't have any strict definition to it. You can't delineate it all that well. It's not very easy to do so, for the most part. And it will always be, you always have to fragment it. Like, you always have to break it up into a way that you can understand it as a human being, in terms of something that likes to personify things and decontextualize them. But that's not how they actually exist. And that's because that's not how you actually experience them. You don't really know how they actually exist, but you know that's how you experience them. And if you're an INFP and you're concerned with the self in terms of the right hemisphere and the precuneus, you know damn well, like, that's how you experience them, and that's the best way you can appraise them. Like, and that's the only way it seems like to make sense to appraise them, because it's true, and that's the only way that we have appraised them. That's the only way we have appraised them for hundreds of millions of years, since hominids have been around, and even before hominids. Like, that's the only way we've known to act as organisms and appraise things in the world. And so that's the way that they act. That's also why they seem very bizarre and peculiar to other people. And it's also what you need to understand about how they choose to act, because it's the case that there are two ways you could figure out how something, well, because INFPs are, so backing up, the reason why they tend to be relationally and self-based is because that's the only context in which emotions are meaningful. It's also one of the few it's also a context that thinking is meaningful in, or can be instrumental, but the problem is thinking takes a very long time. It's slow. Like, it's very, 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 very slow. And it's the case that if you want to be right and you want to be efficient, you don't want to think about how you feel about another person. That takes too long. And you don't want to think about another human being in terms of them as an object, because you don't actually experience them as an object in the world. You really don't. Like, it's really bizarre. And I'm not going to get into how you experience people, but it's crazy. Like, it really is crazy. But you don't experience them as objects. You can think about them as objects, but that's not how you experience them. And it's the case that if you want to map out this terrain in the best way, because it's the one that you most find salient to you as an individual because you're an introverted feeler, then it's not going to be easy for you to talk about things. And it's not going to be the case that you in any local sense makes sense to a person. It's not, and that's why people have a hard time understanding them. It really is, because you're not sure what context of resolution that the INFP finds meaningful at that present moment in time. And they have other drives and other things about them that also makes it such that they're not easy to grip in terms of delineating them. But it's the case that for the most part, their neurophonology isn't set up such that they even want to do that in the first place, or that they find that exercise meaningful. Like, they really don't. And they find being the most meaningful thing in the world. And so that's why they're phenomenologists, and they think you're dumb if you don't think the same way. Like, I'm not kidding. Like, that's how they are. But that's why they're that way. And it's the case that they know no other way to be in the world. They're just a fish in water. Like, that's really what it is. And that's what they see. That's how they're oriented to the world. And that's why their phenomenology looks the way that it does, because they know their individual experience, but they know their individual experience embedded within a context, and embedded within a very long narrative. And they look to see the chain of this narrative and how it's presently acting itself out in whatever immediate context that they're a part of. Like, whether they're aware that they are or they're not, that's what they're doing for the most part. At least when I look at them and I try to figure out what they're up to, like, that's what it seems like that they're doing. And there's a reason why they're doing that, because they're like God the Father in terms, and the reason I say they're like God the Father is because there's something very peculiar about human beings. Human beings are things that are deterministic, and they're also things that are have wills. We're things that are bounded to constraints, but we're also things that have the potential to create, because we're thinking and behaviorally based, as well as being instinctually and biologically based. We can basically use our behaviors and our thinking to act on the world in such a way that we can make tools, rules, and systems to cheat evolution and expedite the process of us becoming lords of reality, if you will. Like, that's the best way I can describe it, because there's something very very fishy about a human being. You know, if a bird is born with a bad wing, it can't come up with a new mode of acting in the world such that it could be successful. Like, it really can't. It's dead, because it doesn't have very many degrees of freedom from its without human intervention. It's dead. Like, because it doesn't have that many degrees of freedom from its instinctual patternizations. And it's the case that we have all of the instinctual patternizations that a bird has, but we have more so, and then some. And because we're like this, INFPs are very, very peculiar, because they realize that they realize that the self can be an instrument towards the ends of ascension, or salvation, or the metagame, like in the ways that any other thing could be used as. And that's basically their modus operandi in the world. They prize the self because it's a tool. Like, it really is. Like, even though they don't treat it that way, like, that's not, and that's the way that I'd most describe it. Because why anything is the way that it is and not any other way is always due to some biological reason or some evolutionary reason that you wouldn't think. Like, you really wouldn't think. And that reality is bizarre in that way. It really is. But that's basically what it is. And it's the case that that's why they value themselves, because it's only by valuing themselves that they can make it such that they're things that can withstand the brunt of reality, or things that can make it such that they can bear the burden of existence. Like, and that's why they're concerned. And that's why they're concerned with the things that are fundamentally human, because even though they're individualistically based, they have to look to the most rich in revivifying aspects of the anthropomorphic landscape that they can, because 1001 won't work. Like, 1000, like, they don't, you know, friendship without love is not, it's cheap. It's not, it doesn't work. It's not enough. It's just not enough, because you have to combat a whole slew and suite of negative emotions that are very visceral to them, because emotions are embodied, and it's very real to them. It's very, very real to them, because they're phenomenologists. Like, they're phenomenologists, and there's multiple tiers of it. There's multiple tiers of it. Not only do they have to deal with the things in their immediate sphere of interaction, but then they have to deal with the fact that evolution decided to make them the creatures that they are. Like, they didn't ask to come into the world that way, and they feel the ways that they've come into the world. Like, in terms of their like, INFPs are they have the potential to be very neurotic, critical, and self-conscious, because they know everything from how they appear to others, how they appear to themselves. Like, they can be even very judgmental of themselves. Like, they very much so can be. People are judgmental of themselves generally, but INFPs can take the cake. INFPs and INFJs, they can take the cake in this arena. And it's because they're qualitative. It's very much so because they're this way. Because and because human beings are this way, and this is the way that they choose to act out their existence. And when I say choose to act out, it's not a choice. It's not a choice, but it really is the way that they're motivated to be. And so it's the case that they feel that on the immediacy of their landscape. Then they feel the ways that the past influences their current history, and then they feel how the institutions around them are set up influences their current history, and then they feel the ways that the state and the federal government and every bloody player in the world, like if everybody just decided to conserve water, everything would be easier. Like that's how they feel it. Like, and they feel that. Like they really feel that. I'm not kidding. They feel that, and that weighs on them. That weighs on them because they're just human. Like they're really just human. And because emotions are your drives and the feelings are their messengers, what the case is that the feelings are trying to always attune you to a better state. It's why you have the capacity to feel negative emotions, because they're telling you something's wrong and you need to do something. That's really what they're telling you. Or you need to distance yourself. Whatever you decide to do is whatever you decide to do, but they're telling you need to do something, for the most part. And so an INFP gets very anxious about what they ought to do. And because doing requires you to be a certain kind of thing, like it really does. Like you can't do math if you're not a mathematician. Like for the most part, alright, there's tiers and there's levels. Like I obviously know that that's not a strict that's not a universal statement. That's not a universal statement. But it's the case that if you wish to do math like in a way that can solve novel problems in mathematics, and in a way that can make mathematics accessible to other people to show them new vistas of mathematical ideas, then you have to be a mathematician. And for an INFP, that's what it means to be, for the most part, because they consider that the bona fide thing. That's how they really think. Like they don't want the thing that's less than. And it's like, because they're valuing things, like they're very value-based things, because the way that they appraise the world is like this. I could have this thing that kind of gets the job done, or I could have this thing that gets the job done more so than this thing, or I could have the thing that gets the job done all the time and in the best way, and they're going to pick the thing that gets the job done all the time in the best way. And since you're a temporal thing, or you're a thing that's bound by time, even the things that are all the time and in the best ways cannot be made manifest in all of the wonderful ways that they can be made manifest without a certain set of prerequisites being met in reality for their summoning, if you will. That's how it is. And it's the case that they know that that's how it is. And so if they're going to be the thing that goes about making the world such that it can make love manifest in reality, or make freedom manifest in reality, they need to become a certain thing. That's what they're about. And so they know that, and so they need to become a certain thing. They need to become a certain thing to make the things that can make life tolerable, worthwhile, and meaningful to be things in the world. And that's what they're up to. That's fundamentally what they're up to. And that's why they're existentialists, or natural existentialists. But at least that's why I consider them natural existentialists. And they're only that way because they're so attuned to the phenomenology of existence, or their existence, and that's all that they think is important. I mean, they might value a thing, but they only value that thing because it's valuable to them as a creature. They don't give two shits about something. I'm just being frank. If it does not affirm their selves. And that's why they're like God the Father. That whole chain of narrative is why they're like God the Father. Because if you look at that, that's very analogous to how you would want to talk about God the Father. Because human beings God has his nature, and God also creates things. It's very strange. Human beings are that way. Human beings have their nature, but they also create things. And it's the case that reality is just one big information-rich matrix. There are things that are extant in the world right now, that act on you, that make you see the world that is, but then you have the capacity to, but then it's also a world of potential, because you have the capacity to act on the world in such a way that things will be made manifest that are not currently in the world, that will act on you and act on others and influence them to see the world in the ways that it is then, that it's not currently in the state it is right now. You honestly have the capacity to change the world, and that's weird. Like, that's weird, but that's what human beings do, and that's what INFPs are fundamentally concerned with. Like, that's what they're fundamentally concerned with, and that's why they care about the self so bloody much. like that's it. But that's why people need to get the hell out of their way and let them be existential phenomenologists. Because I believe this, like I really do believe this. There's a phenomenology there's a phenomenological ecology, and it's the case that the reason human beings can dominate the landscape in such a way that other animals can't imitate or even get close to is because we're highly specialized as creatures. I mean, there's a reason why there's personality, and it makes it such that we're a much more... There's a reason why there's personality in terms of diversity in personality, because it makes us a much more robust species in terms of the problems that assail mankind and its means of existing. I mean, you need them to do what they do, because there's nobody else that's going to do it, and there's nobody else that's inclined to do it necessarily. I mean, we'll do it if we have to, but it just won't be as good as if an INFP does the things that INFPs do. And that's what they need to do. And that's what people need to get out of their way and let them do. Like, at least that's my theory. And it's the case that that's all I'm trying to describe whenever I'm describing phenomenology of type. How, like, that's all I'm trying to describe when I try to describe type. Phenomenology of type. Like, what it actually means for them to exist in the world. And how it pertains to their biology. And how it pertains to their existence. Like, because I mean, like, that's how they exist. Like, that's really... I mean, I swear to anything that... I don't really swear to things, but I mean, like, I legitimately... I talk like that because that's how people colloquially talk. But it's just a case that I'm willing to test that. I'm very much so willing to test that. Like, I'm willing to test that. I think that that's how it is for them. And, some action items, I suppose, then are... That's also why they're... Well, I think I already mentioned it. Yeah, I already mentioned that. So it's fine. Alright, so that's my video on the phenomenology of INFPs. This is a rehash. Like, it's hard for me to like things I make. Like, even if other people like them, it's hard for me to like other things I make. Because I always think that they could be better. So hopefully you found this interesting, and hopefully it was abundantly clear what I mean. And maybe I should summarize so it's very clear. 1, INFPs are qualitative because the brain itself is bilaterally divided in such a way that the hemispheres specialize, and each of the tiers of the brain specialize, and the hemisphere and the tiers of the brain that the INFP is concerned with are the ones that are most concerned with deep contextualization, being watchful and vigilant and interested in relationality, the self, resting, breeding, and eating. Like, that's the best way to describe it. Meaning, basically. Like, that's it. And so they're qualitatively based. And because they're like this, and reality puts 101 constraints on them because they're social creatures, they have to come up with a modus operandi in the world that's most prominently concerned with what it means to be. And that is very interesting because that's the way that most other animals are, but human beings are funny in a way that they don't only have to be that way. And because human beings are also abstracting in nature, they have the capacity to do this thing in using the self like a tool in terms of the creation of self. And the reason that they tend to create themselves is because human beings are goal-oriented and pragmatic, basically, as creatures. We know that we have the capacity to make the world things that it currently isn't. But you can't, because there's a opportunity cost in sugar, proteins, and like a whole bunch of other entropy, basically. Because there's that, and then there's a context in terms of society and history that you're in evolutionary history that you're embedded in. They know that they have to make themselves to be certain things such that they can make all of the things that they find meaningful manifest in the world in any way that they would find existence tolerable and worthwhile. So that's why they look the way that they do, and because the ways in which a human being would go about doing those things, given that they are embedded in the deep context that they're embedded in, is highly versatile and complex. INFPs confuse people, and they don't make a lot of sense. They don't make a lot of sense. But they do make all of this. They make all the sense in the world when you have a big enough microscope. So that's my video on the phenomenology of INFPs. Hopefully, like, that makes all the bloody sense in the world. Like, that's the only reason I say the things that I do, because I just want to make things make sense. And I know you can't put INFPs in boxes, but they're the thing. But a box you can put an INFP in is the thing that you can't put in a box. That's the box that they live in. But there's a reason they need to live in that box. And it deals with, and I guess I'll get to the phenomenological ecology of human beings, because there's a real reason why this narrative looks this way, and it has a lot to do with evolution. Like, it has a lot to do with, like, human beings and their brains. Like, it's funny. But INFPs, just know INFPs are a part of the class of creatures that are human beings that are iconoclastic. Like, they need to be that way, or else we'd be doomed. Like, and it's not like impending doom is always at our doorstep, but it's the case that those moments when it does come, like, we need them. And it's also the case that if we don't want to, like, run over to that place, we need them. And that's the only reason why they exist, because they're useful. Like, they're useful. That's the only reason why any human being exists, because of sexual selection. So that's my video, and thank you for watching. That's the phenomenology of INFPs.